Hey folks, Ryan Gill here with Hunt Primitive, where we entertain, educate, and inspire, and we're working hard to get you where you want to be in your own primitive building and hunting adventures. This video is all about the fundamentals of primitive hunting or primitive archery in primitive hunting. So this is perfect for either folks just getting started that might be having some problems, or even if you do have experience, but this is a good refresher because this is hunting season right now, and this is the most popular time of year for me to get messages and emails from a lot of different people that are struggling to get success in the woods. Whether their arrow's not penetrating as deep as they would like it to, they're not recovering the animals that they're shooting at. Sometimes they're struggling to even hit the animals. And we're going to go over piece by piece all of the different facets of your gear that you're going to be shooting to make sure that you're on point and everything is optimized so you can get the most penetration, the most laceration, the best shortest blood trails, the best kills, and we're going to go over all of it in this video. So this one's definitely going to be a deep dive. I recommend you watch it all the way to the end because there's a lot of good stuff throughout this entire video. So if you're serious about primitive hunting and either want to just do your best, or if you are having some problems, this is definitely the video you're going to want to watch. Dude, I just smoke showed that hog. It got to be 50 yards. First on the list, and this is often one of the biggest mistakes I ever see, and it is the size of the points. I talk about it all the time, but folks, especially that are usually coming off of traditional archery, are used to shooting a very heavy point up front. A steel point is going to be a lot heavier than a stone point in general because stone is a lot less dense than steel, so therefore it takes a much larger stone point to have the same amount of weight as a steel point. And I know that there's a lot of thoughts out there about that you need a lot of mass and momentum and kinetic energy to be able to get the best penetration possible, but that is actually the reverse with stone, because the thing that's not really considered by many people is that because stone is not nearly as dense, it takes a much larger point and there's going to be a lot of friction, and stone point in general doesn't have those sleek, perfect cutting edges. It has to have some degree of serrations to be sharp, and so that's going to slow down penetration. We're going to talk actually about quite a few things that are going to really slow down penetration, but points is usually the number one culprit. So I'll give you an example here. So this is actually a foreshaft for an atlatl, and so this point here is probably about 125 grains if I had to take a guess, and it's very large for an arrow point. Okay, so this would be real tough to put on an arrow and force this through a deer. Now if you're shooting a more modern bow, then there's a possibility that you could force something like this through a deer just fine. But if you're shooting a real primitive bow, this is going to inhibit penetration, and there's a couple reasons for it. Not just the overall size and the extra cutting surface that you have here, but see, it's got a little bit of rounding in the cutting edges. All of this increases friction, and it's okay for an atlatl point because the atlatl has a lot of mass and momentum behind it, so you can get away with a lot wider and more robust point. But on an arrow, this does not penetrate as well as something that's a lot smaller and sleeker. So let's show you one of those. So here is a picture of one of my own personal hunting arrows, and the point's about an inch wide overall and about 2 inches long, and this point's going to be more around the 70 to 80 grain range. And actually this is a little bit larger than I recommend that some people shoot, especially if you're shooting a bow that's maybe a lower performer, which we'll get to later in this video. But that's about the size that you're going to want, and notice that it's got very steep edges. There's no rounding. It comes up to a nice needle sharp tip. We got a lot of scary sharp serrations on this side. Also noticing that our trailing ears do not protrude out past the cutting surface, so this way as it's penetrating it doesn't snag on those ears. If you gently take your finger and run it down just like this, if you're catching on these, you need to chip those back just a little bit because that will start hanging up for you a little bit. But that's about the size that you want. Okay, then especially if you're shooting a bow that's got a little less performance. Give my finger there for scale, okay? A point that's this size, maybe in the 30 grain range, they kill them just as dead. This is going to get you a little bit better penetration. It's obviously not quite as wide, so you're not going to get as much laceration, but we've killed a lot of animals with points this size and even smaller, and they work great, especially if you're shooting a bow that's a little bit of an underperformer, which again we'll discuss here a little bit later. Now, that all being said, I do want to point out that these two books right here behind me, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, and these are all available at huntprimitive.com, so these are my books, okay? And The Secrets and Science of Building Bows and Arrows are going to teach you a lot of this stuff that's really important. This one's really just going to focus on the build of bows and arrows. So if you're just getting started in that, that's a great one. This book here is really going to cover all the stuff that we're talking about in this video and then some, and it's going to give you the science and the reasons behind all the things that I'm saying. It's going to have the data that supports it, okay? So at this point, I'm up to 80 big game animals with primitive hunting implements, so I've got a pretty good handle on what's going on and how to get this done. And so, like I said, this book is going to really give you the ins and outs, and I wanted to show this to you. This is called the Answers page, and it's right at the beginning, and it's almost like what we're going through right now in this video. All of this stuff that I'm talking about is covered right at the beginning. So this way, if you never need a refresher, you just pop the book open, you go to the Answers page, and you could read through all the stuff that I'm basically talking about in this video. So I highly recommend this. If you're very serious about it and that's not in your collection, I would get it because it'll teach you a whole heck of a lot about this. All right, now let's go ahead and move on to the transitions. And by transitions, we're talking about where the point actually meets the shaft. And this is another area that I see so many people making mistakes. Notice that this one's transition is nice and smooth, okay? You can try to do that. Maybe you can see, okay? I can take my fingers and I can slide it up and down and it doesn't catch on anything. A lot of people end up mounding up a whole bunch of pitch on here. They mound up sinew, or sometimes they cut the shaft and they set it in and it's kind of like this. And then he's got these shoulders of the shaft. And remember, all of this stops penetration. To get the best penetration, and we're going to talk about tapering the arrow in 1 second as well. You may notice that there's a slight taper, but you should be able to run your fingers, squeeze them relatively tight together on either side and run them right down, up and down, and not hit any significant snags. So that's one of the tests that I like to do with folks when they're here in person. I tell them to hold their hand up and I say close your eyes, and I'll slide it right between their fingers like this. And I'll say just pinch firmly but not too firmly, let it slide, and let it slide all the way through. If it stops and wants to push your hand, that's going to do the same thing on an animal, on the animal's hide or even the side of a rib bone, and that's going to drastically inhibit penetration. So your transition must be as sleek as possible. And remember, you don't need a lot of mass on the outside of the hafting part of the shaft because we're not really having a lot of side-to-side pressure. All of the impact is on the base, so you want to make sure that your point is really seated into the notch fully, and you can thin the side pieces of the shaft that hold it in. You can thin them down pretty darn thin. You don't need them thick at all. So it's a lot more advantageous to have them slick than to try to have extra meat on there so it's more solid, because all that's doing is slowing down your penetration. Transitions, I think, are one of the top causes of people not getting the penetration they want, because they're getting a tremendous amount of friction as soon as they hit an abrupt transition like that, and it just doesn't want to go in. It really takes the wind out of the sails, okay? So then moving on to tapering the shaft. If we're talking about shooting a river cane shaft like this one, the thin end is going to be the knock end of the shaft, so it's going to grow like this, okay? So this would be the ground down here. This is going to be the top of the cane. It's going to have a natural taper. This thin end is going to be the knock end, and so it's going to get thicker. Well, you're going to notice here, it's thicker here than it is here. And that's because I have filled this internodal chamber. I fill that with a little plug of wood, and then I glue it in. So this way I can thin the cane down without it getting too brittle. So I usually start thinning it right about here and start thinning it down. But remember, this is thinner than it is here, but if we had left it alone, it would have continued to get wider and wider and wider, and then again you'd have that big thick transition. We're able to thin this arrow down into the transition so the whole thing is nice and sleek and it doesn't get too fat too quick. And then once it's up to this point, it's in there plenty far anyway, but it's going to keep going because it's got a wide enough hole that it's going to go ahead and slide through. But making sure that taper that arrow, again, I see this all the time, big fat arrow all the way up to the transition, big fat transition, and then people are like, why isn't my arrow penetrating? That's a big cause right there. All right, so we're going to jump into some bow performance things to consider. Now, if you're shooting a fiberglass recurve or longbow, then it doesn't apply to you as much. I know there are a lot of guys out there that are shooting fiberglass laminate bows with stone points and whatnot, and that's fine. You don't have to worry about too much other than your draw weight and your draw length in particular. You shouldn't have to worry about anything changing as far as humidity goes or string materials. You're going to be using a modern string if you're going to be shooting a modern bow, I'm sure. So you're going to get more power generally out of a fiberglass laminated bow, and so your bow performance probably isn't something you have to worry about too much unless you're short drawing the bow. And we'll talk about shooting over a chronograph here in a little bit too. But as far as shooting a real primitive wood bow, if you're shooting an Osage bow, you're going to have a little fewer problems because it doesn't absorb as much moisture. And if you're shooting a whitewood bow, something to consider is they like to suck in moisture. So especially if you've got a build that, say you did like a heat treated or fire hardened or something whitewood bow, and they come out real fast because it's super dry. You've dried everything out of that piece of wood, and then over time it slowly starts to resorb the moisture, and then the bow gets a little bit slower. So I've seen this so many times over. We did a tremendous amount of tests in the book. We have shown how fast it actually sucks the moisture back in, and it even sucks into Osage as well, but it stops with Osage, where the whitewoods continue to usually suck up quite a bit of moisture the longer that they're out. So you have to keep them in a very, very dry location if you don't want them to constantly be sucking up moisture. So if you're out doing a lot of hunting and it's humid, they're going to take on moisture and they're going to get slower as the season and time progresses. And so something like an Osage bow is usually what real serious primitive hunters go with. That's pretty much exclusively what I shoot and hunt with. And once it's stable, it's pretty stable overall. Shooting over a chronograph is really important. You can get one of those Caldwells. They're like, I don't know, $125 maybe. Shooting over a chronograph is going to give you a lot of information about your bow, and you should shoot over it once in a while. Now, you do not have to obsess over every feet per second that you get and shooting it every week over it, but what I would do is periodically make sure, take your hunting arrow setup and shoot it over the chronograph and get a feet per second reading on it. Because if you happen to start shortening your draw length over a period of time, which I've seen people do, that they get comfortable shooting and their draw length will start to shorten, or their bow starts to take on more moisture. Let's think about it like this. Let's say you got done building a bow, it's fresh, it's super dry, and you go and shoot it over a chronograph. Let's hypothetically say it shoots 150 feet per second, okay? Kind of middle of the road on a primitive bow. Shoots 150 feet per second, and you're like, cool, this works, I'll have no problem. Ryan said that that's enough, you can kill a lot of deer with that. Well, as it's resorbing that moisture over the period of the next month or two, you don't even really notice that it's getting slower because it happens at such a slow rate, but it does in fact get a lot slower. And if you shot an arrow over the chronograph again, you might be surprised that maybe now you're down to like 135 feet per second, and now you're in the threshold of failure on not getting enough penetration. So owning a chronograph and just periodically checking to make sure that you are in fact shooting a relatively decent speed, and we'll talk about those speeds here soon too, is really crucial. And another note about the chronograph is when you shoot over that chronograph, a lot of people want to inch out every bit of draw that they can. They're trying to make the bow shoot faster because it makes them feel good to see that their bow's shooting faster. You should be taking your normal hunting arrow setup, let's say somewhere between a 450 grain to maybe a 525 grain arrow, and shoot it over that chronograph naturally as possible. Don't focus on trying to get a higher number, or I got to pull a little further next time. Shoot naturally, because you're only lying to yourself if you're collecting data from trying to shoot a higher number. You should just be trying to shoot over it naturally and then look at the numbers and make sure that the numbers are okay, as we're going to talk about soon. But also remember, I'm going to make this point right now, but we're going to talk about this later too. A lot of people, when they're up in a tree stand, end up shooting a shorter draw than they realize. So keep that in mind too, that if you're shooting flat and drawing that bow a little extra further, you're getting more feet per second. If you're right on the cusp of, I don't know if it's really fast enough, and now you're shooting out of a tree stand and you're bent over, you might be short drawing your bow. That's very common for people to short draw their bow and then subsequently not get as much penetration into a deer from up in a tree stand, especially because deer's actually a little tougher when you hit it from the top. Up those top rib bones are a little tougher to break sometimes, so a lot of people struggle with penetration out of a tree stand. But again, we're going to touch on that probably closer to the end. Alright, now specifically about the speeds in general, usually what I say is you want to shoot your hunting arrow setup about 150 feet per second as a minimum. Can you do it with less? Yes, of course you can. There's a couple reasons, of course, that you want more performance. If you get up in the 160, 170 feet per second range, that's great. You don't have to worry about anything there. That's all wonderful. You're shooting arrows like I just showed you. You're going to shoot all the way through stuff. I'm usually shooting somewhere between 150 and 155 feet per second, and I'm shooting a legit real sinew bowstring, which really decreases the performance of the bow. Same bow, I put a modern fast flight string on it, I'm going to gain 15 feet per second, sometimes 20 easily over top of a genuine sinew string. So because I like to be super primitive, I'm shooting a legitimate sinew string, and again, it decreases your performance, but if everything else is optimized, it doesn't matter. But so if you can keep it in that 150 range or above on a 450 to 525 grain arrow, then you should see plenty of penetration in whitetail sized game. In fact, I was able to take a bow very similar to this one. It wasn't this exact bow. So that bow was similar to this one. It was shooting between 155 to 160 feet per second, and I actually killed the bison that's on the cover of this book with that bow. And funny enough, we're going to have to transition here soon into arrow weights, is I was able to kill this bison. I got the deepest penetration out of a 420 grain arrow. So you actually don't have to have super heavy weights for penetration if you have all these other things optimized like we talked about with the arrows. But string material does make a huge difference. So if you do find that, okay, I want to shoot a natural material string, and you're not getting the performance out of your bow after shooting over the chronograph, and you're in the middle of hunting season, you may want to consider putting on a B50 string or a fast flight string to try to get some feet per second out, and then work on either building a heavier bow the next year or a better performing bow, or whatever the case may be that is what's wrong with it. But knowing what your bow is shooting as you are naturally drawing, you know, what it's shooting feet per second wise as you're naturally drawing, is going to teach you a lot about your bow too. And we are going to talk about, you know what, I might do it right now. Animals move. Okay, so if you're shooting at a target and you're like, yeah, but I'm hitting just perfectly fine and it's shooting 135 feet per second, and I think if I hit one, I'll get in, I'll penetrate enough and I'll be able to kill it. Yes. Something I've seen a lot is deer are really, really fast, and you want to have that arrow speed in general because you want to be able to get that arrow there as fast as possible, because when deer move, I've seen deer at 20 yards get completely out of the way of an arrow. If you got a loud bow and a slow moving heavy arrow, they can see that arrow coming or hear it and they're gone. Or worse yet, you make a bad shot on one and then it's a non-recovery. Okay, so it is important to have a faster shooting bow or a faster flying arrow because the deer move. Okay, so that's another reason that you're going to want to have a bow that shoots at least about 150 feet per second. And again, can you do it with less? Yes, we've shown that in different tests, but we're talking about efficiency here. Okay, so your string material does make a difference also, as we mentioned, so keep that in mind. I'll look back at my notes on the whiteboard. Yeah, arrow weight. We talk about arrow weight again. There's a lot of folks out there saying you want to shoot a really heavy arrow so you get the most penetration. Like I said, I just told you about the book here. Deepest penetration we got on that bison, which was enough to take down both lungs, was with a 420 grain arrow. In the book also, we did a lot of hunting and killing hogs, and even deer for that matter, with really small little points, and they were very lightweight, and arrows as light as like 315 grains maybe, or 325 grains. I've killed several deer and hogs with low 400s, high 390s or so grain arrows. I don't even weigh them at this point. I just build them. If they shoot good, I shoot them. I'm not worried about it. I have no issue going out tomorrow with my normal deer hunting setup and just going and shooting a bison with it. So you don't need that super heavy arrow like everybody thinks that you do to get the penetration, especially if your arrow is optimized, as we talked about at the beginning of this. But also, as we just mentioned, if you shoot that really heavy arrow, that's giving the deer more reaction time. They're gonna react to the shot, but it could be the difference of that they've moved 3 inches versus they've ducked 6 inches. Okay, so having a faster flying arrow is one of the top things that you should be considering, not being focused on having a 600 or 650 grain arrow because you need all the penetration that you can get. I'm telling you, 400 to 450, 500 grain arrows is really about as heavy as I want, and it has no problem penetrating and sometimes shooting complete pass-throughs on deer. I shot a deer this year that was a complete pass-through. There, look at my arrow. Look at my arrow, son. Are you kidding me? Look at that arrow. It is covered in blood. That was a complete pass-through wherever it hit her, and there's blood everywhere on that arrow. Are you kidding me? And more times than not, I'm getting arrows out both sides. I have to hit some pretty robust bones to not get pass-through penetration. So consider shooting a lighter arrow. If you're shooting at deer and they're ducking and you're missing high a lot, I would consider trying to, if you're especially trying to shoot a heavier arrow, I'd back off of that. Go with a lighter arrow. Okay, here's a couple more, just like a little 2 bonus things that I wanted to talk about that might be affecting some people, because it used to affect me, okay? Whether it's legal to hunt over corn in your state or not, and whether you want to, that's totally up to you. I don't personally have a problem with it, other than I don't like to because the animals are harder to kill. And I like to spot and stalk anyway. That's the fun of the hunt to me. But a lot of people will throw out a bunch of corn so they can make the hunt easier. And I appreciate the concept. You know, maybe you only have a certain amount of time. You want the animals to come to you. You want to just be able to get the kill. I'm not judging you on that in the least. But consider this. When deer, or any animal for that matter, but especially deer, when they come into corn, they know that that is a danger spot to be. They always come in a little freaked out. That's why older ones generally circle and wind you, and then younger ones come in. But sometimes you'll get older ones that come in. But generally speaking, when deer come in to a corn pile, they're on edge. So when you shoot, they are already on edge and they freak out. You'll notice that a lot of the videos that you'll watch on like other channels, you won't really see them on my channel, but people shooting at deer, how hard they react because they're already in a heightened state of awareness. And they shoot, they hear the bow go off, and they're already moving super fast. Where if you watch a lot of my old videos of spotting and stalking, sometimes the deer just barely flinch, or maybe not even at all until the arrow's almost all the way to them, because they're so relaxed that they're just in their normal state. It's like you're really ambushing them, you're taking them by surprise, as opposed to they're already kind of freaked out, and they got springs for legs anyway, so they're already stressed out, ready to run at the first sign of danger, and as soon as you shoot, they're reacting. It's like it's on their mind. So if you're having a lot of trouble killing deer that are moving because they're or if you're having a hard time killing deer because they're moving as you shoot, it could just simply be like if you're hunting over bait that they're just in a heightened state of awareness here, and so you're really going to struggle to hit one when they're already kind of keyed up like that. So you're trying to make it easier by using corn, but you might actually be making it tougher on yourself, if that makes sense. So just consider that, take that what it's worth, back pocket that information. Maybe you'll adjust the way that you hunt if you're having continued issues shooting deer over corn. Same thing kind of goes with a tree stand, okay? Tree stand's great for getting the opportunities, okay? So as a guy that loves to spot and stalk, and I've killed a lot of deer out of tree stands in years past, I don't hunt hardly out of them anymore, very rarely. Not saying I never will, but I like to spot and stalk. I had more issues killing deer out of tree stands. I had more opportunities because they would come in and maybe they didn't win me as easily, or maybe they didn't see me as easily, but the angle in which you're shooting down, it's harder to get that penetration, as we talked about, as the ribs round around close to the spine. They're tighter and harder to break, so they can really slow down your penetration if you hit like two of them square on, because they're tighter together too. So if they're tighter together and your stone point is not up and down but side to side when it hits, and you're essentially having to break two ribs to go through, that can really slow down your penetration if you don't have a very high performing bow, and as mentioned earlier, if you happen to be short drawing your bow while up in a tree stand. So all of these different factors might compound together to really inhibit your penetration. And then if you've got too big of a stone point, or a terrible transition, that can make it altogether worse. But that angle makes it a lot more difficult to penetrate, but also the angle in which the arrow comes in affects what organs you hit. So your target's essentially a lot smaller if you're going to get both lungs. So if you hit it too low, you might get one lung, but not the other lung because you hit too low. You know what I'm saying? And if you hit too high, you're either going to hit the spine, or you might sneak right underneath the spine, miss the first lung, but then hit the opposite lung. And so that angle can make your recoveries a little bit tougher if you don't get a perfect shot. So your margin for error is actually less up in a tree stand. So it's kind of the same thing with hunting over corn, is if you're hunting out of a tree stand, you're using that as an opportunity to get more shots or see more deer, but it may actually be tougher for you to kill a deer out of a tree stand than it is if you were on the ground. So it's like, yes, you might have less opportunities on the ground until you learn how to ground hunt, but your success margin will probably go up because you'll be shooting from side to side, and so therefore your vitals really open up and really gives you a good possibility of making some devastating shots on deer while they're on the ground. Well, we've done this shoot several times before, but that book right there, The Secrets and Science of Primitive Archery, that's what it's all about. And be able to make a shot like that. So just consider all of those things. Remember, the arrow is super important, and the bow's performance, okay? Get your chronograph, test it once in a while, make sure that you are getting the draw length that you need to in order to be able to shoot at fast enough speed. And all that being said, plug the book. Again, this is really the one you want, if you haven't built bows and arrows, or you want to start building them or do better, it ain't gonna hurt to have that book. That book is full color, and it's very descriptive. It teaches you how to build your first bow. So if you've never built a bow before, the first half of the book is how to build your first bow, okay? Then it'll move into the second half of the book, which is how to build your best bow, okay? Highly recommend that if you're building your own gear. If you're not building your own gear, or even if you are, or if you're shooting somebody else's gear, this one right here is going to have a tremendous amount of information for you. Again, you can get it at huntprimitive.com. Let me show you here quick too, the table of contents. You can pause it if you would like. If you decide you want to pause it and then see if you can read through some of that, it'll give you an idea of what to expect in the book. That book has really helped a tremendous amount of people out. I highly recommend having it in your collection, and that of course is at huntprimitive.com. And everything that you've seen here today, if you're new to the channel and you're really interested in this stuff, stone points, arrows, bows, quivers, everything you need is available at huntprimitive.com. So what we do for a living, you know, build sticks and rocks to help other folks out too. And a lot of this too is transitional. So folks want to build their own gear, but if their stone points aren't up to snuff, if they're too round, they're too thick, they're not sharp, I always tell folks, come buy some stone points from me, and you know they work because we kill a tremendous amount of animals every year, until you get your knapping where it needs to be to maybe hunt next season. So if you're shooting some stuff that's not going to perform well, I mean, if you can keep trying it if you want, but if you're not having the results you're looking for, get this stuff from Hunt Primitive and you're going to have a lot more success. And then you can use all of this as a model to say, okay, this is what I now need to model mine after. That's what a lot of folks do, is sometimes they even just buy one point and say, let me go ahead and model that. Or some folks buy a bunch to hunt with for the season, and then if they get to where they get their own knapping skill up, then they don't need them from us anymore, and then that's perfectly fine. Same thing goes with arrows. Folks think that building arrows is like super easy. Building a good set of arrows is actually tough. It's tougher to build a good set of arrows than it is to build a good bow. The bow shoots basically the same every single time, but if your arrows don't shoot the same, your accuracy is going to go down. And if you need good arrows, then go with cane or Tonkin cane, river cane arrows, especially from Hunt Primitive. They're a lot better than wood. Honestly, they don't seem like they would be because of the nodes, but I promise you, if you're getting started, the cane arrows are, pretty much it's all I shoot. It's the best of the best. And get into making this kind of stuff. And again, shoot our stuff until you get where you need to be. And, you know, lastly, again, if you've been having some trouble with it, just go over your gear with a fine-tooth comb. Make sure that it checks out like it says in the answers page, or like we talked about in this. Shoot smooth transitions, properly size and shape points, a bow that's shooting fast enough. Make sure you're not short drawing up in a tree stand. Consider your hunting situation that you're in. I think if you consider all those things, I think that your success is going to go up a lot more. So wishing you guys the best. We'll catch you on another video.